L'Eston 24 in August 1942, Guadalcanal. The afternoon lies heavy on the palms, and the reef breathes in a hush, as if the island is saving its voice for the dark. 8 miles of scraped coral and runway lights without bulbs sit behind the tree line, the unfinished airstrip the Marines took on 7th of August and named Henderson Field. Yesterday, the Cactus Air Force arrived, fighters and dive bombers dropping in on raw coral, engines shuddering, pilots climbing out with salt still on their sleeves. Each day the field works, the sky tilts American. Each day it dies, the sea becomes a road again, and the night fills with enemy ships. The eastern perimeter faces the mouth of the Ilu, the creek the maps call Alligator, a tidal flow that changes personality every 6 hours. A sandspit hooks out like a finger at low water, and flats slide into view, slick and shallow, too inviting. Men have learned the smell of brine and mud that means the tide is raking out. Learned the sound of waves dying over the reef when the lagoon goes still. Foxholes are not deep, but they are tailored. The line is trimmed low, so a man can rest his chin and have the world exactly where it should be in his sights. Interlocking arcs are carved with stakes and sketches. A machine gun team checks the stop on a traverse bar until the arc kisses the edge of the sandspit and no farther. Trip flares lie coiled like snakes in the grass, but orders hold them quiet. Surprise is a currency to be spent later. Mortar crews memorize numbers the way a man memorizes faces: deflection, elevation, charge. They have already walked imaginary patterns across the flats, one grid square at a time, and set aiming posts where no one else can see them. Farther back, pack howitzers sit under camouflage nets, their trails dug in, the crews passing corrections and murmurs to spare breath for the work that will come. At the creek mouth, the 37mm anti-tank guns are set low, barely visible until you step into the pits. Their crews roll canister rounds in their hands as if weighing fruit. Canister is a promise at close range, a door you open that you cannot close again. And the men mark 2 palm trunks and a bleached log as the frame of that door. Scouts and listening posts have been telling the same story for 2 days. In the dark of 18 and 19 August, the Ichiki Detachment's advance echelon landed at Taivu Point, too few to match their reputation, but hungry to prove that numbers are not everything. They burned time on the march west, hugging the beach and the river mouths, cutting the distance to the perimeter with pace and certainty. The perimeter takes certainty and answers with geometry. Let them come across the bad ground, the instructors said stateside. And here the bad ground is a creek that betrays men when the tide tugs it thin. The Marines mark every stump and snag with ranges, paint lines in their minds where the water goes from waist to thigh, where a man will hesitate in the cold, where feet will let go of boots. Reports of movement drift in like the evening insects. A patrol sees shadows long as spears against the last light, hears discipline in the silence. The staff has read the ground, and orders to hold the eastern line hard have already moved out. Reserves settle in behind the hinge of the sandspit. Wire is tightened. The phone lines have been tested and retested. The handsets cool on cheeks that sweat. Belief has crossed the strait from both directions. The Ichiki men trust the night to compress a battle into one decisive stroke, to turn training and bravery into a breaking wave that erases a line. The Marines trust mathematics more than momentum, trust that arcs, ranges, and timing survive fear if hands stay steady. If you want this night told with the heat and detail that makes a battlefield breathe, subscribe to Warpath and stay with me through the hours ahead. Late sun slides off the coconut trunks and the lagoon flattens, tide pulling the creek's throat shallow. The air sits on the skin like a wet shirt. A machine gun team removes and reseats a belt twice just to feel the feed. In a low dugout, a man traces the curve of the sandspit on a damp map and notes the predicted low water near midnight, the moment when feet can mistake slick mud for a bridge. On the far bank, shapes gather in the undergrowth, the light leaving them until they are ideas more than men. Packs are adjusted by feel, blades are bound to keep them quiet. They have studied the sand's pale arc the way a boxer studies an opening. The creek, falling back, suggests a passage with the confidence of a liar who has practiced. Behind the line, a generator coughs and catches, the sound threading through the trees and out over the pits. The runway's chalk-white strip holds the last warmth of day, and somewhere a mechanic knocks a tool against a cowling and listens through metal to judge if the engine will give him tomorrow. Men on the line picture the planes and draw strength from their noise, a promise that daylight can do work if darkness does not undo it first. Flies vanish with the sun, and frogs take the stage, loud and then suddenly not, as if warned. Mosquitoes arrive with purpose. A man tightens his chin strap and feels the helmet bite into his forehead, where the skin is always damp. He breathes through his mouth to quiet his nose. He considers the space in front of him, in yards rather than to feet, and fixes the bleached log at the edge of the flats as his horizon. Somewhere between the mangroves and the sand, someone misreads the relationship between water and ground, between tide chart and truth. The error is not yet visible, but the creek knows it, and the pits know it, and the night will reveal it in the first minute of violence. The first feet touch water, where the creek has drawn back like a breath held too long. Mud takes ankles and then lets them go. A file of men feels for purchase on a surface that changes with every step. Their balance a negotiation with the tide. On the near bank, the pits inhale. Fingers settle at triggers, and safety levers ease under the pad of a thumb. A gun captain rides the final inches of traverse until a palm trunk clicks into alignment, the stop fixed exactly where it must be. The sandspit is a pale sickle in the dark, the flats on either side slick as oil. The first shapes cross the arc of that sickle at a careful pace that becomes urgency, then speed, then a rush that feeds on itself. Weight and will push the line forward until the bottleneck compresses both. A mortar tube gives a soft cough, and a star drifts up, unfolding light that turns the creek pewter. The world snaps into new distances. Water becomes a map of ripples and shoulders. The pale hook of sand glows like bone. Machine guns begin with short, exact bursts, needles of sound that stitch the waterline. The arcs overlap until the gaps shrink to slivers. A man tries to run between slivers and discovers they close faster than legs can move. The 37mm speaks with a violent simplicity, the first canister round opening like a slammed door. Brush and sand burst into a haze of dust and shredded leaf. The effect is a band of sudden emptiness in front of the gun, and then shapes falling beyond the band, as if tripped by air. Mortars walk out onto the flats in pairs and then in threes. The rounds land in a rhythm the crews practiced in daylight, with stakes and shouted numbers. Now, the counting is done with breath, and the bursts step across the shallows as if learning to wade. For a moment, the momentum of the crossing fights the geometry of the defense. Men, already committed, keep coming, the crowding at the narrowest point, turning the sand into a slick ramp. A handful make the far lip, scrambling through razor grass and collapsing into shadow behind a log they thought was a root. They search for the seam that must be there because they reach this side alive. There is no seam. A rifle cracks at yardage that is personal. A grenade lifts a shallow crater out of the damp ground and replaces it with silence. The small space of survival shrinks to nothing. On the flats, spray rises in fans as bullets rake shallow water. The sound changes when they hit flesh, a duller slap, different from the spit of strikes on mud. Steam hangs above the creek in low sheets where warm bodies meet night air. It smells of brine and iron and churned algae. Another 37mm opens, its arc set to rake the margin the first gun cannot see. The canister pellets travel out flat and low, a storm at chest height. A stump splinters into a cloud and then is no longer a landmark to aim by. Crews note the loss and change reference in the same second. The first assault is not a single line, but a series of pulses, each one mistaking the noise of its own arrival for proof that the way is opening. They crowd the sand's bright curve because it is visible and because the tide tells them it is possible. The tide has no stake in outcomes. It only measures time. On the marine side, foxholes bunch around the known lanes. The men speak only in actions, passing a belt, touching a shoulder, tilting a barrel up a hand's width to rake a crest. One gun slows to clear a stoppage, and the neighboring pit adds a beat to cover the gap without needing to be told. A flare drops and dies, and darkness tries to reclaim the creek. Another climbs and hangs and shows bodies where they were not a minute ago. The light makes the scene unreal, and then too real. Every refraction on water looks like movement. Every still shape demands a second look. the eye learns and hardens. Some attackers veer upstream, pushing for trees and deeper water where the arcs might thin. Mortars answer with a new plot that had been rehearsed as a contingency. The rounds break in the foliage with a flat concussion that wrings air from lungs and strips leaves into confetti. At the sandspit's heel, the pressure peaks. Men stumble over men and do not look down. A leader raises an arm and points, a gesture half command and half plea, and is erased by a burst that leaves the gesture unfinished. The wave crumples where he stood and spreads around the absence as water finds a rock. A few who make the near bank do so at the cost of breath and bearings. They flit through the first line of cover and encounter a second line that was never obvious, a scatter of pits angled to catch what slips past the main arcs. Here the distances are so short that noise collapses into impact. Here the rifles settle matters one at a time. The creek itself begins to betray, slick mud lifting under feet that trusted it. A man goes down on a knee and cannot rise before the water around him pulses with impacts. He tries to become smaller than the space he occupies. The space refuses. Across the line, medics are already moving, low and quick, counting breaths, pressing bandages into grooves they cannot see. A runner slides into a command hole and slides back out with one adjustment for a mortar plot, one for a machine gun's beaten zone, one for the angle of a gun that has fired itself hot and needs a new reference. The first crossing becomes the first failure without anyone naming it yet. Momentum dissolves into fragments, fragments into confusion, confusion into dark shapes that stop moving. The geometry is doing its work. The night does not end. It rolls forward a minute at a time, and the second pulse forms in the trees, gathering itself for the same passage because belief is still strong, and the sand still looks like a bridge. The defenders reset their breath in their hands and wait to prove the map again. The second pulse folds into the first, not learning yet what the creek has learned. Men key their courage to the same pale curve of sand and step into a script that looks identical to the one that failed minutes ago. Mortars pick up their earlier conversation as if it had been paused. The crews adjust a hand's width on the worm screw and let the rounds walk where the first line swerved. The flats answer with white plumes that drift and thin and then are replaced in the same spots, the pattern tightening with each correction. Machine guns hold a pace that feels sustainable until it isn't. A barrel change happens under the thumb of a man who could do it blind. The hot steel hisses in damp air, the new barrel threads in, and the rhythm resumes with a microscopic hitch no one beyond the pit will notice. Upstream, silhouettes try the deeper water to escape the arcs. They find footing on roots and then lose it. And when the rounds fall in the trees, the sound is not splash, but thud, a punctuation that rolls through wood and bone together. The pre-registered plots that looked theoretical in daylight now feel like memory doing work. The pack howitzers reach in from the rear with short, mean lobs that clip the creek line where tree trunks meet mud. Their shells burst low and mean, throwing dirt and bark into the night. The forward observers adjust in spare words. A digit shaved off here, a yard given back there, until the edge of the forest is scissored. The repetition has a psychology, and it cuts both ways. Attackers tell themselves the first was a probe, and this is the real push. Defenders tell themselves the first was proof, and this is the confirmation. Each side is right for a minute, then wrong for the next. A runner stumbles into a command hole with a message, the handset cold in his hand. The wire is nicked somewhere between palms and beach. Someone is already out with pliers and tape crawling the line like an insect. Orders hold the reserves where they are. The hinge is strong, the sandspit still the throat of it all. At the sand's heel, the crush becomes mechanical. Men trip on bodies they cannot see and stand again because the crowd behind them leaves no room to fall. A whistle cuts air and is answered by momentum until it isn't. A single canister round erases the space where the front rank had been, and the whistle means nothing. Medics move by touch between pits, counting heartbeats with fingers, listening to breath through cloth darker than the night. They triage without words, leaving a hand on a shoulder for a second longer than necessary before moving on. The creek begins to talk in ways no one can ignore. A slick that was no more than sheen becomes a skin that peels under boots. Mud that held a step an hour ago now slides out from under it. The tide, falling to its lowest, steals options and replaces them with angles. Across the flats, tiny groups find weird luck. Two men follow a seam of slightly higher ground that no one else sees and land in a pocket of shadow near the marine side. They lie there and breathe like animals, waiting for a chance to become movement again. A grenade lands among them and declines to explode. The fuse had been dampened by a river that never takes sides. Luck pauses, then flips. The third assault is not grander, it is more crowded. The line of advance shortens because the sandspit and the creek mouth have taught the attackers where not to go, and the narrowing forces courage into a funnel. The funnel does what funnels do. On the marine side, fatigue takes early, precise bites. A loader miscounts a belt and corrects with the last inch of his patience. A rifleman swaps magazines and drops one that disappears into the sludge. The moment costs nothing, then everything, then is washed out by the next breath. Flares burn holes in the sky and then gutter. Between burns, men discover how to hear motion in darkness. A slop different from tide. A breath carried flat across water. The peculiar scrape of steel on wet wood. Ears do a job, eyes cannot keep. Leaders make choices with information that is only half true and half now. One pit calls for more range and gets it. Another asks for less and cannot be heard under the concussion. A lieutenant holds a small counterattack in his hand like a match, then blows it out and waits, saving the flame for a time when the dark will pay attention. Upstream again, a platoon tries to cross where the creek forks. It is almost clever. Mortars shift to a plot that had been drawn as a what-if on a smudge page, and the first rounds land behind the line of men who thought they had found a margin. They turn and meet water turning with them. The myth frays in silence before it tears out loud. Charge and win depends on space that does not move underfoot and on defenders who do not know their arcs. Here the ground slides and the arcs are rehearsed. Belief hits physics and finds it does not bruise. Time lengthens. Minutes become rooms. In one room, a gun crew cleans a feed of grit and sweat, their hands black to the wrists. In another, a man in a shallow scrape counts the seconds between bursts and fires in the quiet. In a third, a body lies at the edge of the flats and persuades the next wave that the body is a log. Somewhere in the trees, a voice that is not shouted all night finally does. It is a command and an admission. The next push comes heavier and wider on its flanks, feeling for the edges of the geometry, pressing where the arcs might not quite meet. The defenders pull their line taut without moving. It is done with angle more than distance, with fields of fire stealing inches from dead ground. A machine gun shifts a degree and makes a blind patch go away. A 37mm slews two handspans and draws an invisible curtain across the lower water. The fourth attack breaks not on gunfire, but on the ground. Men who have sprinted left discover that sprinting is impossible in water that clutches and mud that tilts. The forward mass collapses into smaller choices, left or right, down or still. None of the choices lead forward. By now, the dead and the living compete for the same square yards. The creek thickens with things that slow the water, and by slowing it, make it betray depth. The passage that looked like a bridge at dusk now looks like a question that no one can answer on their feet. The night, indifferent, keeps its pace. The tide reaches bottom and waits as if listening. The line holds and flexes, a tight muscle around a joint. Somewhere just out of sight, a reserve platoon shifts its weight and the thought of moving forward becomes more real. The map has been right so far. The bottleneck remains the truth. The next hours will test whether truth can also be final. Dawn unthreads the night by degrees, first a gray seam on the reef, then the slow lifting of colors that had hidden inside black. The creek shows its true edges. The sandspit hardens from idea to shape, a pale hinge between two worlds. In the new light, the dead tell the story of the dark. They lie where arcs converged, where the tide made promises it could not keep. The flats are a ledger filled in one pulse at a time. The perimeter breathes out and in, a single long exhale. Men blink hard to reset their eyes. The pits are the same rooms they were before, but the windows are wider now, and the geometry is easier to read. Orders move through the line in voices that refuse to waste a syllable. The east bank must be taken. The creek, which punished attackers in the night, now punishes hesitation. It gives up its fords and asks to be used. Riflemen slide out of their holes and feel the morning on their faces like a cold cloth. They step down into water that no longer lies about its depth. The first section wades with weapons high, the second covering, then they trade the jobs without a discussion. On the far side, the undergrowth yields a little and then fights back with thorns and low branches. The ground rises in inches that matter. Boots grate on sand where roots hide and grab. Men learn the rhythm of this bank in 3 steps and keep it. The envelopment begins without flourish. A platoon curls left along the line of palms. Another threads through scrub to the right, angling to fold the sandspit back onto itself. What was a bottleneck to the attackers becomes a vice in Marine hands. Across the creek mouth, small clusters of survivors watch the light strip the night's cover from their positions. They had waited for a moment like this when movement would not be suicide. In daylight, the math runs against them. Trenches shallow to nothing. Logs turn into outlines. The first M3 Stuart announces itself with a noise that seems too cheerful for the work ahead. Its engine chatters, high and constant, a sewing machine that makes holes in the world instead of cloth. The tank noses out of the trees and takes the sugar sand like a boat taking chop. Its turret turns with the slow confidence of a man looking both ways before crossing a street. The 37mm speaks once, a sharp crack, and a palm frond 100 yards away jerks like an offended cat. The coaxial guns comment in long strings of punctuation, stitching the trunks at chest height. Another Stuart follows, then a third. They keep space between them, because groves lie, because trunks look wider than they are, because the ground keeps secrets where water once stood. Infantry ride their wake on foot, close enough to borrow courage, far enough not to be crushed by it. The tanks do not charge, they press. They feel for roots with tracks and listen for the change in pitch that means a stump has wedged. They nose into pockets and reverse out to let rifles finish the sentence. Their commanders stand half out of the hatches with eyes like compasses and hands that mark angles in the air. On the east bank, a Marine squad finds an old washout that runs parallel to the creek and takes it like a hallway, moving from shadow to shadow, with hips against dirt. At the end of the cut, a handful of shapes flinch and then freeze, unable to decide whether to be targets or ghosts. The decision is made for them from 2 angles at once. Up the beach, another group of attackers tries to break contact by running along the waterline where the sand gives speed. It gives speed for 30 yards and then slopes into softness. A Stuart clocks the arc and lays its main gun a notch low. The round lands like a hammer on a table and turns the table into splinters and air. Resistance stiffens in patches that had been invisible in the dark. A knoll that looked like nothing from the west becomes a spoke in the wheel, directing fire down 2 lanes. Marines pinch it with smoke and 2 flankers, and when the smoke lifts, there is only open ground where the spoke had been. The creek's mouth becomes a corral. The envelopment from the east closes like a door, the hinge the sandspit, the latch a thin line of men kneeling to fire in sequence. Those who had made it to the near bank in the night and lived find themselves facing the water again, not as a path forward, but as a mirror showing exactly how far there is to go back. In the groves, the tanks earn their reputation as much with steadiness as with steel. A Stuart nudges a berm where a machine gun had been and finds the pit empty. The crew shifts a yard and the pit is full, the occupants having hugged the wrong side in fear of the first direction. The coaxial rakes the earth until it looks raked. A flare goes up out of habit and is unnecessary. The sun is doing better work for free. Its light lays open every crease and hides nothing. The edge of the forest, which had seemed endless the night before, shows its limits. There are no mysteries past the trunks, only choices. If fire slackens, not because ammunition thins, but because targets do. The last pockets are anchored by trees that will outlive everyone on the field, by logs that had fallen long before anyone here was born. The logs are lowered into history one by one. A pause enters the sound like a shy guest. It starts as the absence of one gun's growl and grows as if silence had weight. The men notice it in different ways, by the return of insect noise, by the clarity of one voice among many, by the fact that they can hear their own breath and it is not ragged. Smoke finds the low places and stays there, making the creek look warm. The air smells of oil and pulp and something metallic that does not belong to tools. A tank's engine idles while a crewman wipes dust from a sight with the edge of his sleeve. the gesture no different from the maintenance done on the runway behind the trees. Messages go back along the line with care. This pocket reduced, that bend held, a trickle of prisoners motion toward the rear with hands open and eyes down. Litters come forward for those who will be carried. A name is called and not answered. It is called again and then put away for later. The perimeter, which had flexed like a bow all night, settles into a shape that feels sustainable. Men drink and find the water warm and indifferent. They look at the ground as if it could be trusted now. It cannot. It can only be read more easily. The numbers will be counted later, and they will not agree from account to account. Even before they are written, the field knows what is asymmetrical and what is not. It knows that belief met a surface it could not change. It knows the tanks arrived at first light and tilted the math until sums were simple. By late morning, the creek is a normal place again, if you squint, and if you have never known it otherwise. The sandspit gleams pale, a line that will vanish when the tide takes it back. The tide is on its way. The men stand down an inch and prepare to hold everything they have won against the next thing that comes. By noon, the island tells the truth without raising its voice. The creek gives up its bends and lets the light settle into every crease. The sandspit gleams as if nothing happened there, and yet every grain remembers. Henderson Field hums behind the palms, steady as a metronome. Engines turn, wheels lift, and the runway's chalk-white breath becomes reach that only daylight and aircraft can grant. Yesterday, the field was an argument. Today, it is a fact you can hear. The Cactus Air Force rides that fact in loops over reef and tree line. Their shadows cross the creek mouth like signatures on a contract the night failed to void. Each circuit confirms what the line bought in mud and sweat. On the flats and in the groves, counting begins. It is imprecise and persuasive. Between 700 and 800 attackers undone by angles and tide, and on the marine side, dozens dead, something like 70 to 100 wounded. The numbers will drift, the shape of the outcome will not. Asymmetry needs no rhetoric. It stands there under the sun and explains itself. Courage met physics. Belief hit a surface that would not change to accommodate it. Charge and win, fractures on the simple stubbornness of ground. Shallows that promised speed stole it. A pale hook of sand became a funnel. Crossfire rewarded patience and punished certainty. And geometry spoke in a grammar the dark could not confuse. Nothing magical did the work. Ranges rehearsed at noon did. Arcs trimmed low enough to touch water did. Mortars that remembered their plots when hands shook did. The pack howitzers pressed the edges until the forest had nowhere left to hide. The night fed doctrine into mud and took its taste back to both sides. It was metal and salt and algae and smoke and the grit you could not spit out no matter how much you tried. It was also breath counted in fours until panic yielded to muscle memory. Quiet lessons survive the thunder. Reconnaissance is humility with a map. Timing turns mass into leverage. Keep a reserve where the hinge is, not where you hope the hinge might be. Spend bravery in places the ground will pay you back. Courage mattered, but courage yoked to the wrong surface bled away in inches. Courage attached to survey stakes and sight settings made distance behave. The creek, indifferent, judged both with the fairness of water. By late morning, victory looks like chores resumed. A generator coughs and catches. Fuel drums sweat in the shade, and men roll them anyway. Someone chalks a number on a blade and calls it good enough for another sortie, because good enough keeps the field alive. The M3 Stuarts do not pose for memory. They idle, clank, and vanish behind trees to be serviced, as ordinary and as miraculous as tractors in a harvest. Their legacy is not spectacle, but insistence. First light changes the math if you bring enough steel to do the counting. Add a map table under netting. Pencil lines smear and redraw the morning in quick strokes. A note beside the creek reads, "The sandspit is not a bridge in any tide." Another marks the east bank envelopment with a small arrow and two initials that will matter to a handful of men and no one else. Dispatches walk outward in widening rings. Offshore, sailors rate about the creek and decide sandbars deserve respect. Inland, a breeze threads the jungle and whispers a ridge's future name. Edson's ridge is not here, and yet it is, waiting as the consequence of a field that refused to go quiet. Henderson's survival changes the sea as surely as any cruiser duel. Daylight will cut the express into pieces. Dusk will still be dangerous, but daylight has a vote now. Every hour the runway beats is another hour. The island sky leans the same way it did at dawn. The tide climbs and begins to erase what men wrote with boots and blood. The sandspit brightens, thins, and fades back into water. The landmark disappears, the lesson stays, the ground forgets, people mustn't. Debate will nibble the margins of the ledger in tense and histories, but the center holds. A few dozen dead here, and scores wounded, hundreds dead across the water, a myth disassembled by angles and tide until only facts remain under the sun. The line that bent all night does not boast. It breathes, drinks warm water, and ties its boots again. Work is what comes after fear, if you are lucky. Work is how you keep a heartbeat going when the heart is an airfield behind trees. Someone knots a tag and double-checks the spelling. Someone stacks canister tins in a neat pyramid and flinches only once at the scrape. A corpsman folds a bloody compress and tucks it away because he cannot throw away proof. From a distance, you could rewrite the night as arrows and blocks and captions about doctrine. Up close, it was a foxhole the size of a bathtub, a log used as a horizon, a runner carrying a single-digit correction that moved a mortar burst 10 yards and saved a squad. What was held is not just dirt. It is time. Time for planes to rise, time for a division to learn, time for a campaign to lean toward a future where the field is still loud at noon. Hold the field, and you hold the story's heartbeat. Lose it, and the rest is written by someone else under a different sky. This island never grants certainty, only chances. The men here took a chance and shaped it with measured arcs and steady hands. They let the creek's lies reveal themselves. They spent their bravery where the ground would pay them back. As afternoon settles, insects reclaim their bandstand, and the airfield's engines filled the distance between now and whatever comes next. The heart behind the palms still beats, steady as a hand on a traverse bar, steady enough to carry belief into a new shape that daylight respects. The content of this video is compiled from many sources. If there are any errors or corrections needed, please leave a comment below. Thank you, and see you next time.